Hi, everybody. I'm John Foster. This is the fourth in my Cold War Presidents series for this year. I'm a librarian here at Mentor Public Library. I have a PhD in history from the University of Washington, which is in European history, but I try and do these talks about something that's, more often than not, I try and do them in something that's not exactly my specialty, because part of my sort of rationale is giving myself an excuse to read some books that I'm interested in reading. And in this case, I gave myself the reason to read all four, and I swear to you, I read all four of these, of Robert Caro's apparently soon-to-be 5-volume biography of Lyndon Baines Johnson. The first one, Passage to Power, like a lot of juvenilia. The second one is really, really fascinating in the sense that it's about his election to, or it's about his military service, and then the third one gets into his election in Texas in 1948, which I'll talk a little bit about in the talk, which was won by 82 votes, I believe, and which was, to this day, viewed as one of the most incredibly corrupt elections in the history of the state of Texas, which is truly impressive. I mean, it featured him. He ran against Coke Robert Stevenson, and it really wasn't. It was the Democratic primary, because at that point, weirdly enough, from the perspective of the moment we live in now, the Republican Party in Texas was moribund in those days. So whoever won the Democratic primary was going to win. And he was running against this guy, Coke Robert Stevenson, who's the former governor, incredible straight arrow. The guy just didn't campaign. And he wouldn't make any campaign promises. He used to really frustrated the people running his campaign, because he would just not promise to do anything. And he would say to, people would go to his speeches, and he would say, well, if you want to know what I'm going to do, look what I already did. I'm going to do more of that. And Johnson ran this incredible campaign. He bought a helicopter, and he was flying all over Texas. And he took hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars from Brown and Root, now Kellogg Brown and Root. There's a great extent to which the election was really purchased by Brown and Root, especially in these counties down in the Hill Country and in southeastern Texas, where the sheriff would just line up all the voters, and there would be election observers there, and the sheriff would be like, there's the chair that you sit in. I don't want to hear from you until, this poll is closed. So somebody was asking me earlier, before the last talk, about Amity Shlaes' book about the Great Society. I have, as I said in the last talk, real respect for Amity Shlaes, because she's the presidential librarian for the Coolidge Presidential Library. And I swear, if I had to get up every morning and think to myself, I'm going to read some more about Coolidge, I would crash out. There's no way I could do that. No disrespect to Calvin Coolidge, he's not very, of all the presidents of the United States, not the one where you find yourself ooh, Coolidge. But maybe that's just my prejudice talking. Also, The Best and the Brightest, which isn't strictly speaking about Johnson, although he plays a certain role in it, is just a book that's really worth reading. It's, I think, the sort of most interesting book about the Kennedy administration, of which there have been. It gets into the Johnson administration too, but I think about the most interesting book about that time. Johnson, as we all know, became president on the 22nd of November 1963 after John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. And it was one of the more traumatic days in the history of the United States. The vast majority of people who you talk to who were around then can remember where they were when they heard it. My dad, my mom, everybody remembers this was roughly almost 5 years to the day before I was born, so I don't remember it immediately. But it inaugurated, the inauguration of Johnson in a way, or the swearing in of Johnson, was a kind of shift in American history in a way that we're still kind of living out to this day. Johnson was a really fascinating guy and a real mass of contradictions in a way that is very dissimilar to a lot of other presidents. So if you look back at other Democratic presidents particularly, although he's from a kind of poor background, very similar to Harry Truman, not very similar to Franklin Roosevelt, he is very different than Truman in that he has this intense need to be liked. One of the most defining features of Lyndon Baines Johnson was this need that he had to be liked, to be respected. and yet he had a bunch of really somewhat unlikable characteristics. He also involved the United States, I mean, I think it's fair to say, in much deeper in Vietnam than, I mean, Kennedy, it's pretty clear from what we know now, was seriously considering trying to back the United States out of Vietnam in 1963 before he was assassinated. And there's a pretty extensive sort of speculative debate about what might have happened if that had happened. So if we take as a premise, right, that the spread of communism is a bad thing, and I think if Americans agree about nothing else, they agree about that. So what would have been the consequences of not escalating in Vietnam? Now, there was a certain body of thought, and it wasn't just all people on the sort of let the doves fly peacefully anti-war types who thought to themselves, well, if Vietnam goes communist, right, then it's the Chinese's problem, not ours so much, right? Because, you know, if you look at the sort of history of Vietnam, the one defining feature of Vietnamese culture, and I mean for 1,500 or 2,000 years, is the intense hatred of the Chinese, because the Chinese viewed Vietnam as a southeastern province of China. And Ho Chi Minh said at one point, we have to eat French dirt for a decade or we'll be eating Chinese dirt for the rest of our lives, by which he meant to say having the Westerners back in for a while after the Second World War is okay, because it will help us to establish ourselves, you know. And for a long time, there was a nationalist Chinese army running around in the northern part of Vietnam. It took them a long time to get them turfed out of there. But also, you know, Johnson he's a person, and I mean not to put too fine a point on it, to whom the N-word came with a certain frequency, especially in his younger days. And yet, he is also responsible for 2.5 of the most important pieces of civil rights legislature in the history of the United States. And I say 2.5 because the Housing Rights Act of 1968 kind of didn't work out, not in the way that the Voting Rights Act and the earlier civil rights stuff had. If one were to script the early life of a man to become president of the United States, one might be tempted to place him in a patrician family with Summers and Hyannisport. I mean, you know, John F. Kennedy or Franklin Roosevelt growing up the Hudson Valley, perhaps a prep school education and a touch of European polish. Lyndon B. Johnson had none of these things. He was born in 1908 in a farmhouse near Stonewall, Texas, in the hill country, part of the state better known for its rocks than its prosperity. I mean, if you've ever been to the Texas Hill Country, even today, you get driving out in the Texas Hill Country, you might as well be on the moon. I mean, it is some far out place. And I come from Eastern Washington, which is a pretty, like, you know, by the standards of, you get emptiness in Eastern Washington in a way that you do not get in Ohio. I mean, and no disrespect to Ohio, and how would it be? But you know, I can remember at one point driving with my wife between Walla Walla and Spokane and just being like, I mean, it wasn't even wheat fields. It was just like nothing. His father, Sam Ely Johnson Jr., was a man of charm but of limited fortune, a state legislature whose career was more notable for its failures than its successes. His mother, Rebecca Baines Johnson, was educated and ambitious, but found her energies channeled into her family life. And his father at a certain point, this is another sort of way that he's kind of similar to Harry Truman. His father at a certain point was sort of ruined, and Lyndon Johnson went from a relatively prosperous life for what things looked like in the Texas Hill Country to a much more straightened existence. Johnson was not a brilliant student. He was a bright guy. He was restless, more interested in storytelling and dominance than in books. He was a very social guy, right? I mean, I think it's fair to say. He attended Southwest Texas State Teachers College. I think it's Texas State now. And he worked as a teacher in South Texas in a school that had a lot of Latino children in it. And this really marked him. He wasn't one of these people who was sort of instinctively about racial equality, but he did look at a lot of these Latino children and say, wow, they really have disadvantages, economic disadvantages in life, and how can I be the one to, you know, in what can I do to try and make them, you know, put them on a path to where their sort of citizenship in the country can be comparable to that of people from from more privileged backgrounds, so to speak. Yes, that is the Johnson family farm and the house that he was born in, which I believe is not there anymore. And that's him with his little sister in a cowboy hat, looking very fetching, I think. There he is as a young man, and here is one of his classrooms from his school. And if you could see it a little more closely, you can see that probably 80% of the kids in this picture are Latinos. The most important formative experience in this years was not in the classroom, but in the schoolhouse once again. After graduating in 1930, Johnson took a job teaching Mexican-American children at the Wellhausen School in Cotulla, Texas. The town was poor, and the children were poorer, and the experience seared itself into Johnson's memory. He saw young boys and girls arriving to school hungry, barefoot, often unable to speak English. For a man who'd himself grown up precariously close to poverty, the lesson was profound. Decades later, as president, when he announced his war on poverty, he would recall those children Cotulla saying, "They never seemed to know why people disliked them. But I knew. I saw it." This, perhaps more than any book or lecture, shaped Johnson's conviction that government could and must act to uplift the disadvantaged. And that's really the defining feature of Johnson. I mean, this is, once again, another of the great ironies of Johnson's presidency, right? He comes into the presidency as a guy whose sort of primary goal is, what can government do to sort of give people a leg up? Not to support them, but to give them a path to improvement. Just to sort of advert to something I mentioned earlier, I was asked by somebody before another one of these lectures about the Amity Shlaes book about the Great Society. And Shlaes, who's very conservative, takes this position that the Great Society programs failed in the sense that they created a kind of dependency. I don't think that if you really look at, I mean, the Great Society programs had some problems, for sure, and the way that they operated was not optimal in all cases. I think they had some very notable successes. We'll talk about that a little later. Shlaes' problem, I think, and feel free to read the literature on this and tell me I'm wrong. I'm happy to be proved wrong by anybody. Is that she leaves a lot of possible things on the table. So if you're going to write a critical history of something, and I think that that's a fabulous idea, you got to deal with all the relevant stuff. And she picks and chooses examples that fit the argument she's trying to make and leaves aside some things that don't fit the argument that she's trying to make. And this is not to say that her argument is wrong. Personally, I think that there are better books about the topic, but the real point is that to be more successful, there's some other stuff she would have had to deal with responsibly. So that's, if you want to look at sort of what bias is about, like as historians, we can't deal with every single fact about the world, right? There's like too many. So the way to be even-handed, to the extent that it's possible to do it, is to take a representative set of the facts and deal with everything, and deal with the major stuff that disagrees with what you think. And I think that's the problem with Shlaes' book. Although once again, I strongly suggest that people read it. I think we have a copy of it upstairs. It's well written and really worth your time to read, for sure. Johnson's political model, and in many ways his political father figure, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He adored FDR. By the early 1930s, Johnson had decided that really he wanted to get into politics. He became a political aide to Richard Clayburgh, who was a representative from Texas. Clayburgh was a fairly well-to-do sort of guy who was a little more interested in playing polo than he was in doing the business of the House of Representatives. And so Johnson became one of a number of sort of young staffers who essentially ran the business of the House. Now, Johnson came to really disrespect the House, and there's a famous quote from Johnson, and I apologize to you for the salty language that I'm about to use, but this will come up a lot in Lyndon B. Johnson's talk. The difference between a senator and a representative is the difference between chicken salad and chicken shit. Which is not quite as awesome as Cactus Jack Garner, another famous Texas politician, saying that the vice presidency wasn't worth a pitcher of warm piss. But they have a way with the lingo down in Texas, and I think that we should roll with them. Johnson really admired Roosevelt's ability to command loyalty, to dominate a room, to transform the role of government in American life, and he attached himself eagerly to the New Deal. Johnson really sort of, sold himself to Roosevelt as a New Deal true believer, and someone who was willing to get things done in the House to make it happen. In his own crude but genuine way, he became a New Dealer to the core. By 1937, opportunity knocked in the form of a special election to fill a congressional seat in Texas. Johnson campaigned with ferocious energy, which was really, I mean, when he combined, if you ever read the Caro book about his 1948 Senate campaign, he campaigned himself nearly to death. I mean, he was so sick by the end of the campaign from just running himself ragged. He wasn't sleeping. He could barely eat. He was constantly, his hands were raw from shaking too many hands, and from so that he had to constantly be rubbing this weird purple salve all over them to keep them from. Yeah, it was nasty. Johnson campaigned by crisscrossing the district, shaking every hand, remembering every name. He had an uncanny ability to remember people. And when in the Senate campaign in 48, he would fly into these towns in a helicopter. Half the time he's in some dinky little town in East Texas, and he knows somebody there. They'll come to the field where the helicopter is. It's hey, Bob, how you doing? I mean, it's miles different than, say, Roosevelt or Eisenhower, but very similar to Truman. Truman was a guy who could talk to these people in these little towns because he'd walk behind a plow. I mean, Truman had plowed a furrow. And let me just tell you, from a person who's driven a pea combine, getting out and doing that farm work, even with technology, is not easy. Driving a pea combine for 18 hours is not pleasant. Walking behind a plow drawn by horses, I can only imagine. At the age of 29, he won the election. He was a congressman, and he never looked back. His congressional career in the late 30s and 40s was marked by a loyalty to Roosevelt and a talent for ingratiating himself with powerful figures. He cultivated Sam Rayburn, the formidable Speaker of the House, who became his mentor. Sam Rayburn, brilliant politician from Texas, had some sort of problems, I think, from the perspective of our sort of modern cultural mores, but whatever. The guy was absolutely brilliant political operator. And I'll tell you this story. It's a little out of order, but it's one of my favorite Johnson-related stories. So when Johnson became vice president under Kennedy, he went to the first cabinet meeting, right? And they have all these guys who are just major, Bob McNamara, who'd been chairman of Ford Motor Company, and Dean Rusk, and all these people who were really high power guys, right? And Johnson is kind of awed by this, right? And he goes and he's having a drink with Rayburn afterwards. You also have to remember, anytime I talk about these politicians meeting with each other, assume that a certain amount of bourbon is being consumed, because it was probably a fair, considerable amount. Anyway, so right, he goes to have a drink with Rayburn, and he's talking about how each one of these guys is more brilliant than the last, and the Brill-Cream guy from Ford is the most brilliant of the bunch. And Rayburn says to him, "Well, Lyndon, they may be as amazing as you say, but I think I'd prefer it if just one of them had run for sheriff at least once." And that's a great point, right? Because these guys are all this is why The Best and the Brightest is an interesting book, because these guys are all technicians, right? They're all guys who've come from academia or business. They haven't come out of politics, and they haven't had the experience of having to put themselves in front of the voters, right, and say, this is what I'm going to do. Is this what you want? This is what I'm going to do. This is what you should want, right? And that was a big issue for Rayburn. So the war breaks out, right? Second World War. He's looking for a way to get into the Senate, right? Because he's done this work in the House of Representatives, but he knows that the Senate is really where it's at. But when the war breaks out, he goes down to Texas. He's if war comes, I'm not going to be one of these guys sitting around Washington. I'm going to be out on the front lines. So the war comes, and he joins the Navy, and he goes around doing stuff for a while. He's out in California for a while. But then he gets sent out to a combat zone. And there's a long story here, and I really recommend that you read Caro's book on it, because I don't have time to go into all the minutia of it. But he goes out on one bombing mission. And it's a pretty rough mission. But that's it. And then everybody involved gets the Silver Star, which I think is pretty weak, to be frank. I mean, the Silver Star is like the third highest combat decoration, and I think that's pretty sorry. And it wouldn't be quite so sorry, except he then uses it to sell himself. So when he's running for Senate, he bangs that drum over and over again. And that's, if I'm perfectly honest, that doesn't do favors to the guys who really went out there and risked their butts. My grandfather won 2 Silver Stars, and I assure you he was not sitting in the back, in the rear areas when he did it. He was driving a tank. In 1948, the Senate seat in Texas comes open, and he decides to run for it. He ends up running against Koch Robert Stephenson. And the campaign is just awash in money. He starts from about 20 points behind. And this is the Democratic primary once again. Like at that point, the Republicans would run anyone who would put up the money in Texas, because they just would not win. This is back in the old days of the Solid South, which broke apart or shifted during Johnson's presidency. Johnson buys his helicopter, he flies all over Texas, he nearly kills himself campaigning too hard. And he also does Koch Robert Stephenson pretty dirty. He sends guys around the state of Texas to go hang out in bars and spread stories about Koch Robert Stephenson. You want to guess what they said that he was? Take a wild guess. He's a communist. Because, or they would say, well, Stephenson himself might not be a communist. People around him. And I mean, it just kind of shows you the power of that kind of accusation, especially in 1948. Yeah, I mean, right, yeah, this is like social media, like hanging at the bar style. And there is zero evidence that would link Koch Robert Stephenson or anybody in his orbit to communism. But that was just the coin of the realm, 1948. You want to say something really nasty about somebody and not have to prove it? Say they're a communist, right? Because even if there's no evidence there's a communist, right? Well, communists are pretty sneaky, right? He could be a crypto-communist of some kind. Anyway, so there's this another reason to read the Caro book. The Caro has written these 4 books, and he's apparently on the 5th one now. He's kind of, I think he's 87. I mean, he's pretty old. But he apparently told a reporter that he's about 900 pages into the 5th volume.
Oh, wow.
And he's only up to about 1965 or something like that. And I mean, I read, if you only read one of these books, and nobody would blame you if that was the case. The Master of the Senate is one of the best books ever written. If you really want to understand about how politics got done for most of the 20th century, just an absolutely, I mean, it's in like psychedelically minute detail. It's really unbelievable, like what level of granularity he gets into. And it includes just tons of fascinating details. Like, they were going to have this hearing where MacArthur, during the whole sort of scandal in Korea, MacArthur was going to come and address Congress, and he was 45 minutes or an hour late, and one of Johnson's staffers, I think it was one of Johnson's staffers, said, well, it took time to get him down off the cross. But there were multiple challenges to this election, which were only prevented from going through by a series of ex parte interventions. I mean, it involved, like, at one point someone flying to Connecticut to get a federal judge to say that he had no jurisdiction because it had to be sorted out in the state of Texas. And while it did, there's a certain clock that has to be met, and the clock ran out while that was happening. And there was a hearing going on which got stopped in mid-hearing, and they just had to there was some, like, if you're interested in how political corruption used to work in the United States, this is, I mean, like, there are accusations of political corruption now, which I think mostly in the United States they don't have a lot of evidential foundation. This, on the other hand, oh my gosh, Jim Wells County down in southeastern Texas. At one point, I will tell this story and then I will move on. Like, it turned out they were, like, looking at the ballot rolls and how the votes had been cast, and it turned out that, like, okay, so one vote total had been reported, and then they reported a revised total 48 hours later, and all of the names on the last part of the list were all in alphabetical order.
Oh.
Which meant that either 150 voters had all showed up in alphabetical formation, or that somebody had been sitting in an office just writing names down off the rolls. And as a gag, they made one vote for Stevenson and like the other 149 for Johnson. The corruption was really startling. Johnson rose to become the Senate Majority Leader, and he was one of the most effective politicians in the history of the Senate. Whatever you can say, whatever else you want to say about Johnson, he was a guy who could get stuff done. He was a guy who worked across the aisle. He was relatively centrist. He got 2 pieces of civil rights legislation passed, 1957, 1960, mostly by watering them down. And what we're going to talk about a little bit later as we get into the real meat of this is that civil rights legislation tended not to get to the floor of the Senate for 2 reasons. One was the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee tended to be run by Southerners, so the longer you were in the Senate, the better committee assignment you got. And the Rules Committee tended to be run by Southerners who would just not let civil rights legislation get out of committee. But if it did, the Senate also has the filibuster, which meant that if you do not stop talking, you can prevent any other business from getting done. And they would just filibuster these things until, people would say, okay, we give up. Under Johnson's leadership, the Senate became more efficient than it had been in decades. He brokered compromises on civil rights, on tax bills, on foreign aid. He was no moral visionary. His support for civil rights, for example, was more tactical than heartfelt in those years because he knew that the northern sort of urban, more liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and liberal also means a couple of different things. There was a very strong train of liberalism in the South, but it was very racially inflected, which is also not to say that there was not racism in the North, too. I mean, the situation is complicated and could be the subject of its own lecture or series of lectures with which I will not burden you right now. But he understood that the Democratic Party could not reign yoked to Southern segregation forever. Just remember, there's 20 Southern senators, right? So if they all vote as a bloc, that means you need 67 votes to get cloture, right? So if that's the case, you have 33 votes, minus the 20 who are going to vote against you. So you can only lose 13 votes, right? Which means that if the Southern senators do not want it, it will not happen. He also understood that if he wanted to be president, he would need a record of accomplishment, which he really did not have in his time in the House of Representatives, ironically enough, because he was very effective as a staffer. He just didn't really apply himself that much as when he was an actual rep. The irony is that Johnson's dominance of the Senate was achieved almost entirely on domestic grounds. He was a creature of the committee assignments, of appropriations, of legislative calendars. Foreign policy in the Senate of the 1950s was not his forte. He supported Truman's containment strategy. He backed Eisenhower's foreign aid budgets. He voted for NATO funding, but his speeches on international affairs were pedestrian, his instincts conventional. He was, as one observer put it, a man who could master the politics of cotton subsidies, but not the politics of nuclear deterrence. And this is something that really played forward into his presidency. 1960, he gets tapped to be Kennedy's vice president. Why? Well, not surprisingly. Kennedy was very strong in the Northeast and in the West, and not that strong in the South, where he was viewed as, this rich kid, which he was, very liberal, which he wasn't. Really, if you look at what Kennedy actually did, he was really not. He was a very centrist guy, actually. But he has that Northeastern accent, which if you're not used to, it's ironic that the Southerners. I'll tell you just a funny story. I went to library school at the University of North Carolina, and I had never lived in that part of the country. I lived in Maryland for a while, but Maryland is a different world than, like, you hit Southside Virginia and you're that's another place altogether. And it was weird being down in the Carolinas and knowing that the first word I said, people be like, "You're not from around here." I mean, it's, like I have a pretty polyglot American accent, right? I mean, I grew up mostly in the western part of the United States, so I sound like people from Washington State. So he becomes Kennedy's vice presidential candidate, and then vice president. And you would think that that would be a great, I mean, they brought him in because he had that Southern twang, right? And he could talk to the Southerners in a way that they would hear. But then they kind of fridge him. And this is one of the great ironies of the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration, I really recommend Arthur Schlesinger's 1,000 Days. It's a big old thick book. Schlesinger was an academic at Harvard who became a sort of advisor in the Kennedy administration. 1,000 Days is a kind of like worm's eye view of what went on in the Kennedy administration. Absolutely fascinating book. And what you really get out of it is what a centrist administration the Kennedy administration was for real. Like, they were strongly anti-communist, so they get sort of saddled with the Bay of Pigs thing, which the Eisenhower administration had sort of concocted, not planned very well. But I mean, Kennedy, just to be clear too, in case I was not like, I don't know if I mentioned this, I hope I did in the Kennedy talk. Kennedy told the Bay of Pigs leadership, the leadership of the Cuban exiles, under no circumstances will U.S. forces be directly participating in this. And afterward, like, I've heard this from dozens and dozens of people. Well, we gave these undertakings to these people. No, we didn't. Matter of fact, he then later sent, I'm trying to remember who, I think Schlesinger was one of them, a sort of delegation to meet with them a little later in the process, and just to like reaffirm, there will be no like direct U.S. participation in this. And which is a good thing, because the whole thing was a harebrained scheme. I mean, it was really a terrible idea. But, Kennedy for real was profoundly anti-communist. I mean, look at his Berlin speech. That's one of the sort of strongest anti-communist statements you're going to hear, like getting out there to West Berlin, which is a thorn in the side of the communists, right? And saying, like, the fact that you people are here is one of the most important things going on in the world right this minute, right? But Johnson's kind of fridged in the Kennedy administration. You would think that they would use him as a way of dealing with Congress, right? Because the guy is the absolute master. You've got a guy who's a ninja level congressional operator, but they don't use him. They kind of sideline him because they thought he was kind of a yokel, which was, okay, not entirely untrue, but not true in the way that those snooty Northeastern liberal types thought it was. And I mean, I say that as a guy who comes from a family of academics from Jersey City. If you grow up in sort of like, there's like two kinds of Irish people in the United States. There's the New York area Irish and there's the Boston Irish. And I didn't really understand the difference until my wife taught at Harvard for 3 years and we lived in Boston. I was like, wow, you people are a whole other thing. Like But I mean, Kennedy also was trying to sort of like his father, Joe Kennedy, was like fought hard to kind of de-ethnicize himself. So, and then Dallas happens, and all of a sudden, Johnson becomes president. And Johnson, and this is one of the weirdest turns in the history of American politics, decides that what he's going to do is that he's going to go hard on this domestic agenda that he's got. And it's an agenda of trying to use the government as a means of uplifting people, not like a welfare state in the way that the British have. Like, if you want to know what the welfare state is like, I went to school in England for a while in the 1980s, and there, if you didn't have a job, I knew plenty of people who were perfectly able-bodied who didn't have jobs, who would just show up at the dole office every 2 weeks, get their money, and once every 3 months they had to go apply for a job, and they had to get a form signed that showed they'd applied for one, and that was it. There was no nothing. I mean, that was it. And one of them had the biggest record collection of anybody I've ever met in my entire life. That's not what Johnson's liberalism was about. Johnson was, let's sweep away the things that are holding people back so that they can fully experience the sort of bounty that is the American dream. And I mean, that's, I think, a fundamentally right idea. That is to say, like, what we want to do is, uplift people, not to just sort of hold them up, but to put them in a position where they get the full measure of benefits that being an American should give you. So in the sort of interregnum period between November 1963 and the election 1964, he starts really laying the groundwork for what he wants to do in terms of civil rights and signaling the Great Society, which is going to be his policy agenda. He takes a very cautious attitude toward foreign policy. He really, he tries to strengthen our relationships in NATO, but he knows that foreign policy is really not his métier. So what he wants to do is focus on domestic policy and try and not let foreign policy take care of itself, right? But he's not going to engage it in the way that the Kennedy administration, where sort of foreign policy was their kind of main thing, right? The election 1964 against Barry Goldwater. So he absolutely demolishes Barry Goldwater, who he paints, I think, not entirely incorrectly, as an extremist. So this is the famous Daisy ad, where they show the little girl like pulling the things off the daisies, and then a gigantic nuclear explosion. So Johnson is a voiceover at the end of it. I mean, but it's I think it's drawn from something else. And according to Bill Moyers, anyway, this is in the Rick Perlstein book about Barry Goldwater. It's called The Gathering Storm, I think. They didn't really tell Johnson beforehand that they were going to do this. And then Johnson saw it and was like, called Bill Moyers up, was like, who was his press secretary, was like, or his, like one of his aides. He was like, what? Oh my God, that's some serious stuff you just put on TV, right? Because you're basically accusing my political opponent of being like ready to like foment nuclear Armageddon. And Moyers said, well, like this is a political campaign. Moyers is another Texas guy. And they're all like, we're out here playing hardball. And Johnson was like, okay, I think it's fair enough. So he wins a pretty convincing victory in the presidential election 1964. And he uses that to springboard his Great Society program, the War on Poverty, the Economic Opportunity Act, the Job Corps, Volunteers in Service to America, which is kind of like a US version of the Peace Corps, Head Start. Head Start, I mean, if you've ever hung around like early childhood education, does an amazing job of getting kids who come from disadvantaged backgrounds like up to the level. And if you know anybody who works in primary teaching, like and I know a fair amount now because I have a 10-year-old and an ex-wife who's a teacher. Really, it's really noticeable that these kids who come from households where they have other challenges, it takes them a bit of getting up to get to so they get to a sort of equal playing field. Medicare, Medicaid, I don't want to get too much into this, mainly because the government is shut down because of part of it. It's not like, there's an argument we can have about it, but it's not right to have it now, and it's not, I wouldn't be doing you guys any favors going off about one side or the other. But Medicare, a key program for people who are older. I mean, there's lots of people, and this is one of the problems with the Schley's book. Just to point out, not to pound on Annie Schley's, but if you look at outcomes for older people, what you have to do when you're looking at programs like this is look at expected mortality rates and actual mortality rates, instead of like trying to look at each case and be like, well, they didn't really help that person, but they helped that, you want to look at, and the like, after Medicare, like, tangible improvements happened in mortality rates for seniors. Like, Americans just live longer. That's something that Schley's doesn't really get, that she sort of leaves on the table. The Truth in Packaging Act, the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, the Highway Safety Act. I mean, those of you who can remember traffic safety education in the 1970s and 80s, where they'd show you those films, like, Blood on the Highway and Mechanized Death, and just be like, oh my God. Like, they showed me one of those in traffic safety education. I was like, I'm never driving again. Jeez, my God. The Wholesome Meat Act. Yeah, I don't think I need to explain the Wholesome Meat Act. I think we can all understand why that's an important thing. But these are the really key things in the domestic. He manages to get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, even though the Rules Committee is chaired by Howard Smith from Virginia, who's an ardent segregationist. But what ends up happening is, well, a couple of things. One is Johnson really exploited his knowledge of the Senate rules. They really used some, I think, interesting sort of technical tactics to get these things through. And then I think they filibustered it for 60 days. But what Johnson figured was that this piece of legislation is a popular piece of legislation. The sort of idea of America is bending toward this idea where we don't want segregation in public facilities, because it's un-American. I mean, you know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. And there's a complicated argument around this, which we don't have to have right this minute, but the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex. Interestingly, when they were debating this, it didn't include sex, and one of the conservative Democrats came out and said, offered an amendment to add sex. And the reason he thought he did it was because he thought that nobody would vote for it, that would be the thing they would kill it, right? And then the ultimate effect of that was that, in fact, like, sex discrimination was included in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because you got the spin wrong on that one. Similarly, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlaws literacy tests, plays on to the outlawing of poll taxes. Once again, the literacy tests are so dishonest. They would force, like, African Americans to take these tests and to register to vote that that I couldn't have passed, right? That get down to a level of granularity about American politics that most of us don't have. And it's just dishonest, right? And what Johnson says about this is the answer to people not voting in a terribly wise way, right, is not less voting, it's more voting. Like, so you want people to get the experience of, looking at what political candidates have to say and making decisions about the way they want the government to be run. Because that's the way that the government will sort of move forward. That's the way that the national project will move forward. The Civil Rights Act of 1968, otherwise known as the Fair Housing Act, runs into some problems. By the time it's happening, okay, so we have this memory of Martin Luther King as a sort of national hero. By 1968, he was a very problematic figure in American politics. He had come out strongly against the Vietnam War, and although now sometimes we look back and be like, well, there was profound national sentiment against the war, that's not really true. There was very passionate sentiment among a relatively narrow group of people. And King had come out against it and had really gotten pilloried even by people on that side of the aisle. Also, fair housing is something which has a much different element to it than voting rights. Because it's one thing if people different than you want to vote, right? It's an entirely other thing if they want to move into your neighborhood and reduce your property value, which was the argument that people opposed to this used. And it was the argument that had been used for decades. As a matter of fact, there's a famous case in Euclid in the 20s or 30s in which a real estate company wanted to build a bunch of houses that they were going to make available to African Americans, and they were prevented by the courts from doing it because the people who lived there already said, well, like, we have an investment in this area, and if the ethnic character of the locality changes, that will reduce our property values, so, like, that's unfair to us. Eventually it does get passed. It actually gets passed almost right after the assassination of Martin Luther King, 1968. 1968 is this very intense year in America, which we'll get to in a minute. But the thing that really comes a cropper with Johnson's administration, okay, so the first couple of years of the Johnson administration, between, say, 63 and 65, things go along pretty smoothly. Like, he manages to get his agenda mostly through Congress. But all this time, the problems in Vietnam are building. And Johnson, unlike Kennedy, hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about it. Kennedy, by the time he committed U.S. Marines to Vietnam, or advisors to Vietnam, had been dealing with communism in Southeast Asia and Laos. He'd, gotten into a pretty nasty conversation with Khrushchev in Vienna. Kennedy had thought a lot about foreign policy. Johnson had not. Johnson didn't know a great deal about it, wasn't immensely interested in it, was very much inclined to listen to what his generals said. By the way, I really recommend, as American citizens, that you find on the internet the Pentagon Papers. Pentagon Papers was a secret history of the Vietnam War that Robert McNamara had composed, I think in 66, 67, late 60s, later part, after Kennedy's death. After he had started to become convinced that the thing had gone really wrong. It's about 3,000 pages long and has about 4,000 pages of accompanying documents. And it's known about because somebody leaked it to Daniel Ellsberg, who then gave it to Neil Sheehan from the New York Times. And also separately, somebody else leaked it to reporters at the Washington Post. Right, yeah, excellent movie too. I mean, it's weird too because they all get it in sort of like disordered pages and they're all trying to read through it out of order, trying to figure out what's in it. But it's online now. It's really worth reading because if you want to know what the Defense Department and what the hierarchy in the United States government really thought was going on in Vietnam, and the jarring thing about it is that they knew that it wasn't working. It's very clear that they understood what they were doing was not working. Their only solution, as Clark Clifford, who had been in the national security bureaucracy since the Truman administration, Clark Clifford was one of the people who wrote the Clifford-Elsie report. He was brought into the Johnson administration as a sort of advisor on this topic. And Clifford, would go to the military higher-ups and say, okay, how many troops is it going to take to get this fixed? And they would say, well, we don't know. And he would say, well, is it going to be 100,000? We don't know. Is it going to be 200,000? We don't know. And they did these studies about the strategic bombing, the attempts to bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and what they discovered was that it had no appreciable effect on the amount of men and material, and also, not only did at one level it not have any effect, but the amount of men and material did not track the amount of bombing. So the more bombing they did, you would assume that if it was having some kind of effectiveness, the more bombing they did, like the level of men and material would go down, but it didn't. And the Defense Department knew it. And that's really, if you want to understand. So finally, like when Nixon and Kissinger get in there, they know this too. And almost from the first day, Nixon and Kissinger is like, we're going to find a way to declare victory and leave, which is what they did. I mean, I used to work with a guy who had been a colonel in the Vietnamese Air Force, and he was angry at all aspects of the American. He'd spent like 5 years in a re-education camp in Vietnam after the war, and so I didn't question his opinions about anything. Like I feel like right or wrong, you got a right to think what you want to think about this, pal. But fascinating guy. But he's very angry at Nixon, even though he was a dyed-in-the-wool Republican. I mean, the guy was like, every time I mentioned this is Washington State, where the Democrats are very powerful, and every time I mentioned voting for a Democrat, he was just like, these people are idiots. But he was like very angry at Nixon because he thought that Nixon had been the one who really sold them down the river. He also thought that they were right on the verge of winning then, which was not true, sadly enough. But you can see by 68, end of 1968, there's 536,000 American troops there. And it's funny, so read the Pentagon Papers. It's absolutely fascinating reading, really, really interesting. But also, if you look at the books that get written about Vietnam, right? So 1964, 65, you get Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War. Philip Caputo, U.S. Marine, absolutely fascinating book. And then toward 67, 68, 69, you start getting books that are written by guys who are in the Army, and they're all conscripts. The one that most people have read, The Things They Carried, or the book you wrote before that, If I Die in a Combat Zone. And the author's name is escaping me, but he's U.S. Army, and he talks about seriously having considered going AWOL when he was in Seattle waiting to report. Like he considered heading up to Canada, just never coming back. Because by this time, I mean, those Marines who go over there, they're all volunteers. In the beginning, at least, in 63, 64, 65, that's volunteers. When you start getting into the conscripts, then you get these people who are just like, well, why in the hell am I here? Like, these people don't want me here. This is going badly. 68, you get the Tet Offensive. The military's been saying for years, things are getting better. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's not the beginning of the end, but it's the end of the beginning. And then these are US Marines, and this is the city of Wei, which is the old imperial capital. And in January 1968, during the Tet New Year, the Lunar New Year, the Viet Cong, I say Viet Cong, you really should use the term National Liberation Front. Viet Cong is just a term of abuse. Stage a massive series of attacks in Saigon, in Hue. They take over the city of Hue. They execute people left and right. I mean, it's extremely grim. This is a sick thing about Vietnam, really, because you can't look at either side and be like, wow, there's the real heroes. Like, it was just atrocities everywhere you look. And this is a shock. And then in the middle of it, you get the police, like the head of the military district of Saigon, blowing the brains out of that guy, which happens while a US news crew is standing nearby, and it ends up on the evening news. And you can say, like, they argued afterwards, well, this guy was a terrorist and he'd killed all these innocent people and yada, yada, yada. You cannot just blow someone's brains out in the streets when you're working on our dime, right? In front of a US news crew. You just can't do that. You know, we're all adults and we all know what goes on in wars, right? But like, that's, just summarily executing somebody like that, it runs against the American way of doing things, because you wouldn't want it to happen to a US soldier. And lots of brutal things happen to US personnel in captivity by the Viet Cong. I mean, like, you don't have to search very far to find some incredibly grim stories. But, we should be about the moral high ground. I mean, I think is the number one thing. By this time, Johnson is kind of beaten down, and finally in March 1968, he gives this speech. Tonight I want to speak to you about peace in Vietnam and in Southeast Asia. And he says, given the gravity of this thing, I don't want to devote even 1 minute to partisan political activities. Therefore, I will not seek nor will I accept the nomination of my party for presidency. And this is an intense thing. This is a sitting president saying, I am not going to run for re-election. And it throws the Democratic Party into a sort of complete chaos. Robert Kennedy is running, then he gets killed. You have Eugene McCarthy, you have George McGovern. No, Hubert Humphrey. McGovern was 72. Right. But isn't Ribicoff nominating McGovern though? He doesn't get to it in the speech.
I thought McGovern came along and said.
Well, he did. You're right. Because the 68 Democratic Convention in Chicago, there's rioting in the streets between students, some of whom are of a kind of like more leftist coloration. Some of them are just people who think that the war is a bad idea, right? The Chicago police really go after them, and it's a weird scene, right? Because it's Chicago is a very democratic city, and it's run by Richard J. Daley, and one of the great Chicago machine politicians. I'm just going to narrate this because this is one of my horribly favorite moments in American politics. Abe Ribicoff gets up to nominate George McGovern, who isn't going to win. He says, I wanted to give this speech, but while this is going on, the Battle of Michigan Avenue is going on, and the police and the protesters are going at it. And he famously says, I came to give this speech, but I have to speak to you of the trouble in my heart. This is Abe Ribicoff, senator from Connecticut, former governor of the state of Connecticut, former official in the Roosevelt administration. And he says, if George McGovern was president, we wouldn't have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. And that's an intense thing to say. A Jewish senator is getting up at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago and says, we would not, if George McGovern was president, we would not have Gestapo tactics on the streets of Chicago. And the place just explodes. I mean, if you ever watch the film of this, people are just like, holy cow, that's an intense thing. And he says, if George McGovern was president, we wouldn't have a National Guard. What he means is we wouldn't have the National Guard in the streets. And then he says, they flash down to Richard J. Daley, who's sitting there with a bunch of his political associates, and you hear the voiceover from the guys in the news, and they're like, Mayor Daley is not very happy with Senator Rubikov, which is true, very much an understatement. And then he looks, you can see him, I mean, this is the thing that people sometimes miss because of the intensity of the opening line. You can see him look down. He looks off to the side, and he's looking straight down at Richard J. Daley. And he says, how hard it is to admit the truth when we know the problems facing this country. And it's like him saying, okay, Richard J. Daley, in case you were wondering if I had just called you out at the Democratic National Convention in your home city, yes, I very much knew that was exactly what I was doing. And Daley is down there calling him lots of things that start with F. I mean, he's calling him everything but a child of God. I mean, it's really not, And Daley is not, I think not unreasonably pretty upset about this. Number one, because what are the police supposed to do, right? It wasn't like, I think they overreacted, right? But they had to do something. These are guys who, a lot of them are young, a lot of them have families serving in Vietnam, and here these young yahoos are, there's a lot of anger surrounding it, right? So it's not, it's one of those things that it's an illustration of how divided and angry that the country had become. And so, of course, at the end of this process, Richard Nixon gets elected, and this starts a real change in the tenor of politics in the United States. And just to give you a preview, next year, I'm going to do a series of lectures not on that, but on the Roman Empire, on the fall of Rome.
That's safe.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Yeah. It'll be what it will be is fun, and really interesting. But I have tried in lectures to kind of stay away from politics and living memory, because it's hard to do it without seeming to take a political line that I'm sticking up somebody's nose, and I really don't want to do that. This is, I try and only tell you things that are not totally non-controversial, but for which I have good evidential foundation for. When we get up into Nixon and afterward, we get to things that people are still personally connected to and pretty angry about. But I think I might try and go into that territory just to sort of talk about the things that we know for real, the things that we know as facts. And then, you can head over to BJ's or wherever and argue about the things that we really disagree about. But
wait, what's the context of the picture of McNamara?
this is another one of my favorite. This is a meeting, I believe this is early 1968, and it's after the Tet Offensive. By this point, McNamara has really come to understand. If you read McNamara's book later on, he really did have a kind of change of heart about what the whole thing was about. But you can see Johnson just it's not hard to parse what. But here's Johnson in Vietnam shaking hands with soldiers. Part of the problem with Johnson with respect to Vietnam was he really felt like we, America, had given an undertaking, right? That we were going to support South Vietnam, and that if we backed out of that, it would be dishonorable. And also, when you're the president, you are the guy who is responsible for all the people's children who don't come back from this, right? You are the one who has to talk to the Gold Star parents. And that's a heavy responsibility, and Johnson felt it, and also he could hear from the White House protesters chanting, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And that's an intense thing for a human being to have to bear. I mean, to think about someone accusing you of being a child killer. That's not nothing. So, Johnson's legacy was really shaped by the fact that he was a Cold War president. I mean, okay, so he had all these like domestic policies that are important. You may think to yourself, like, well, why, if we're talking about the Cold War, are we going to talk about that? And the reason is because one big point of motivation for this was that the Soviets are out there saying, look, America talks all this freedom stuff, but look at the situation of blacks. You know, they're getting shot down in the streets. They don't get to vote. So there was one big motivation for the civil rights legislation, for the equal rights legislation, was to try and rebut that criticism that we weren't really living up to the ideals that we were sort of promoting as fundamentally American ideals. You know, you read the documents on which the country is based. We hold each truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We the people, in order to form a more perfect union, we the people, in order to form a perfect union. Like, yeah, I know. Right. Provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, share the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity.
Yes, but say you were just a bill.
Right, yeah. I think that bill's got a lot bigger problems. But Kennedy's legacy is really twofold, and it's really based on this sort of Cold War, the fact that he was a Cold War president, right? Because on the one hand, he has all these domestic programs that did a lot of good, did not succeed in the way that he had hoped. Partly because large amounts of federal dollars were being devoted toward the war in Vietnam. I mean, the war, like you can say war is an obscenity, but what it really is obscenely expensive. He did work with NATO. He did work to expand the containment strategy. And, you know, it was funny. So I worked as a teaching assistant in a course on the Vietnam War when I was at the University of Washington getting my degree. And the professor, Christoph Giebel, had these two guys come in to talk to the class. One of them had been an intelligence officer in the Army and was very anti-war, was very critical of the whole thing. The other one was a guy who'd been a Marine helicopter pilot, and I think he must have worked for the company too, because I was having lunch with him and he was talking to me about like flying missions in Cambodia. But his view was, we won. And the reason is because where did communism spread to after that? Nowhere. And I'm like, I'm eating my, pad thai, and I'm like, interesting theory. I mean, he was a great guy, had like absolutely fascinating stories. So you can look at Johnson and say, well, is his presidency a failure? His domestic agenda doesn't quite succeed in the way that he hopes it. I mean, he does some very important things. Civil Rights Act of 1964, profoundly important. It was voting rights, profoundly important. The housing thing didn't work out quite so well. Did he stop the spread of communism? Well, the spread of communism was stopped, right? No one became communist after that. And he pursued the Vietnam War in a way that was devastating to his presidency, right? I mean, by the end of his presidency, he couldn't have got elected dog catcher. He had spent all his political capital partly on his domestic agenda, but to a great extent on the Vietnam War, which had cost him a lot of support. Now, once again, we don't want to inflate the numbers of the anti-war people. It's funny, there's a really great documentary about the Weathermen, I think it's where it happens, where one of them, it might be Rudd says, people look back at this and it's like they think that it was just like these huge gatherings all the time. And he was like, most of the time as anti-war activists, we were alone, where there'd be like 10 or 15 of us. It wasn't like it wasn't like Woodstock. But so this is the sort of really fascinating thing about Johnson and why I think it's worth reading about him and learning about him. Because he is a guy who, in a lot of ways, overcomes a lot of challenges. Like, he overcomes a background of a certain degree of poverty. He overcomes his sort of upbringing in an area where racial equality is not looked on with a great deal of favor. But he ran into the problem that he just couldn't fix, right? He was a deal maker. At a point, he came back from Vietnam, he visited Vietnam, he gave this speech in which he said, look, if the North Vietnamese will stop these attacks, we will do a gigantic hydroelectric program that'll supply power to the North. And Bill Moyer's reports are like flying back from this, and he said that Johnson sort of leaned over him and patted him on the knee and said, "Old Ho can't turn me down." But of course he could, because Johnson just never understood Ho Chi Minh or people like him, right? And this is the great tragedy of Johnson, that he had a certain skill set that was very good at certain kinds of things. But he was a president when something else was really called for, different kinds of skills. And this is a tragic thing about his presidency, because it could have been so much more than it was, even though he did some very important things. Thank you for your time.